I can't believe that the measures being proposed with net zero and so on, which will cause immense pain and suffering and diminution of all the advances people have made, will reduce their futures, will leave people feeling this is a good thing. And so I think once the suffering begins, there'll be a much greater incentive to question this. But unfortunately, I think we've gotten to that stage where it's going to be the pain that'll turn this around.
Richard Lindzen is an American atmospheric physicist, known for his work in the dynamics of the middle atmosphere, atmospheric tides, and ozone photochemistry. He's published more than 200 scientific papers and books, and he's been the Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also the lead author of Chapter 7 of Physical Climate Processes and Feedbacks of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's third assessment report on climate change. And he has disputed the scientific consensus on climate change, and he criticizes what he calls climate alarmism. So, Professor Lindzen, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I'm taking I find that the subject of climate change a very complex one, even though I'm trained as a physicist myself, and there are so many features to it that I just wanted to start very basically and see if we can find whatever the assumptions are which are underlying the whole current narrative of climate change. So can we start off very basically and with the question of, is the Earth actually warming? And if so, is it dangerous?
Well, that answer is, of course, that people have looked at this with great care. And I think there is good evidence that the Earth has warmed a little over a degree since the end of the Little Ice Age. I wouldn't consider that anything to be alarmed over. The Earth normally changes by that much over various periods. But I think the more essential thing is, once one starts with that, the question is, what does one mean by climate?
Mm-hmm.
Is this really an index of climate? After all, the Earth has dozens of climate regimes. And the notion that there is one thing behind all of them is pretty absurd. And that brings one to a question. Once one starts with the warming and then one goes on to the greenhouse effect, and of course, you're a scientist, I'm a scientist, but most of the world does not have a scientific background. And that includes the educated elite in our Western societies.
Unfortunately.
And what we fail to realize, I think, is that these people do feel insecure in their ignorance. They know there is a wide world out there, and they don't have much of a grip on it. And so when an Al Gore tells them, well, it's all the greenhouse effect, and CO2 is like adding to a greenhouse blanket, and adding a blanket makes you warmer. You can't imagine the relief they feel that they now understand science. And they stick to that. I mean, it's consoling. The trouble with that is there are at least two aspects of climate that I think have to be considered. One, different planets have different climates. I don't think anyone would argue with that. Venus, Mercury, Mars, all are very different.
Yeah.
And they are so different that the greenhouse picture gives you a good handle on the difference between planets. what we forget is what we on Earth, as Earthlings, consider major climate change, the ice ages, 50 million years ago, the Eocene, when the Earth was much warmer, are really small perturbations compared to changes between different planets. And they have a very different origin. They are primarily due to the change in temperature between the tropics and the poles. And anyone who studied meteorology traditionally knew that the Earth has different climate regimes, but most significantly, there's a big difference between the tropics and the extratropics. In the tropics, the role of the Earth's rotation is minor, and you wipe out gradients in the horizontal. So it's pretty uniform in the tropics. And it's governed by something called the Hadley circulation. You then have a kind of boundary. In the tropics, the temperature is decreasing until about 16 kilometers. And then at the edge of the tropics, around 30 degrees, you have the subtropical jet. And that's a kind of boundary between the tropics and the extratropics, mid-latitudes. And in the extratropics, the tropopause, where the temperature stops decreasing, is about 12 kilometers. And there's a kind of jump there. The physics of the two areas is very different. In the tropics, you do have a dependence on the greenhouse effect. It's not the total thing. It also has to deal with the flux to high latitudes. And in the extratropics, the temperature difference between the boundary of the tropics and the pole is determined by processes in the extratropics. It's not an amplification of whatever is going on in the tropics. That was widely understood at one time. And yet now we've completely skipped the extratropics. Instead, we call it polar amplification, as though it's controlled by the tropics. All the tropics do, to use technical jargon, is to introduce a constant of integration. Let us say, if you have the greenhouse gives you 1 degree warming, it isn't that it's amplified at the poles, it just adds a degree at the poles. And without that amplification, there is no basis for saying that 1, 2, and even 3 degrees in the tropics is going to be catastrophic. We're still talking about temperature changes that we know we deal with every day.
Can I mean, you mentioned the complexity then of the
Sure.
the range of areas on the Earth itself. Is it sensible then to ask about what the temperature of the Earth is and just give a single number to that? How accurate is that number?
I mean, the number is probably good to, I think, a few tenths of a degree. But the question is it a relevant determinant of climate as we refer to climate?
Yeah. Is it?
I don't think so.
Because of the complexity of the
Sure. The sphericity of the Earth means that, you know, when you have a rotation, the Earth is rotating, and the rotation vector, let's take an idealization, is just vertical at the poles. And at the equator, it's horizontal to the surface. And that means at the equator, the Coriolis force is not effective. It is effective in the extratropics. That makes all the difference in the dynamics.
Strangely, I mean, I've never heard anyone who is let's call them a climate change alarmist for the sake of a terminology here. People who ramp up the fear of climate change. They're very keen on telling you what the temperature is of the Earth and how the temperature might go up by 1 degree or maybe 2 degrees.
Yeah.
But they never mentioned anything about the dynamics here or the Coriolis force or anything like that in terms of its effect, do they?
Well, they know it's a blanket, right?
Yeah.
I mean, John Kerry gave the game away. He gave a lecture once and he said, we all know how difficult chemistry and physics can be, but climate science is easy enough for any kindergarten child to understand.
Well, yes. Certainly, I've seen some of the models of these things, and they're some of the most complicated things I've seen, and take a huge amount of computing power. So I don't know how you could.
Well, you're integrating the Navier-Stokes equations, and most, quote, climate scientists don't even know that.
Right.
And these are highly nonlinear equations that have never actually been solved. I mean, there's now a controversy over whether anyone has proven that there is a smooth solution.
Right. Let me move on to the probably the hottest topic of the issue, which of course is CO2, because there's a huge amount of effort right across the globe here in trying to suppress levels of CO2. Trillions of dollars are being spent on trying to keep CO2 out of the atmosphere, and closing down fossil fuel power stations. Is CO2 the main cause of global warming, first of all, or not global warming, but the rise in temperature that you've just described? Is it CO2 induced, or what is causing it?
Let's keep it straight. The global mean temperature is a peculiar index. And I've often asked people, and might ask you, how do you take the Earth's temperature?
Well, I would guess the way you do it is you take the temperature at many different points on the surface of the Earth and then average them.
What happens when you average Mount Everest and the Dead Sea?
Well, I suspect you get somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but what does it mean?
Well, what does it mean? Yes, that's a good.
Yeah. Different altitudes and so on. And so they realize that doesn't work. That isn't what they do.
Right.
What they do is at each station, they assign a 30-year mean to the temperature at that station. They agreed to use the same 30 years at every station. Right. And then look at the deviation from that, what they refer to as the anomaly.
Right.
And they average the anomalies. So they say, well, we'll average, if it's warming at each station, the amount of warming or the amount of cooling. Okay, so you do that, you get a graph, and what's missing in that graph? The data points.
Right.
You might think the data points are kind of clustered around that average, but they're not. They are densely scattered over an order of magnitude greater range than the temperature change they're trying to evaluate.
Right.
So, they're seeing something on the order of 1.1 degrees in the century. The scatter is over 20 degrees.
Right.
What does that mean for any given station? It means it's almost as likely at any given station that it's cooled rather than warmed, because the spread is so great and this is such a small residue. So they leave out the data points, and everyone is convinced that they are feeling what's happening to this small residue, which is nonsense. Mm. So, the classic example I know is the Gulf Coast of the US. The temperature there, certainly by the time I checked this, which, was in the 90s, had been decreasing for many years. And it resulted in major changes in agriculture, in the Florida Panhandle, citrus growing stopped, and so on. When you surveyed people after this alarm began and asked them, has it been cooling or warming? Almost all of them said it's been warming. It wasn't true, but it was like Goebbels' old claim, you tell a big enough lie incessantly and it becomes the truth.
There's a kind of a bandwagon effect, isn't there, where everyone jumps on and repeats the same thing. Eventually, a critical mass of.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
you're talking about a degree. Who feels a degree? And, when you go outside.
Yeah. Tell me though, coming back to the CO2 issue, those variations then in temperature, which have been measured over many, many years, is CO2 the main cause of that warming? Or is the sun the main cause of it? Or is, I don't know, volcanic activity the main cause, the Earth's movement? Or do we not know?
Again, you're doing something that is puzzling to me.
Go ahead.
You think that if this funny index, this average anomaly, is varying, it might have a single cause, that it had to be forced, that something had to do it. But from your own experience that when you have turbulent fluids, large systems, they change without anything forcing them. Think about it for a moment. You have the sunspot cycle, okay, on the sun. Is there anything forcing the sunspot cycle?
Well, we're not aware of anything that does that. No, I don't think so.
It just does it.
Yes.
The turbulent fluid, and it vacillates. You have the Earth's magnetic field, reverses every so often. Is something pushing it over? No, it's again a fluid system. Fluid systems flip. Every number of decades or so, the Dead Sea overturns. Did somebody push it? No, it just did it. And we keep ignoring the fact that these systems just vacillate.
Okay.
So probably the major change is internal.
Okay, so it might not be CO2 at all that's causing it. It's either spontaneous in some respect.
Look, CO2 over long records doesn't correlate well as a causal factor. When you look at the ice cores in Antarctica, it's now pretty well established. CO2 followed temperature, didn't lead it. You go back to the paleo reconstructions of the last 600 million years since the explosion of life forms. There's no obvious correlation between CO2 and estimates of temperature.
That's an interesting point there, because I thought that the whole climate alarmism thing was predicated on the idea that, look, CO2 is going up, and we can see, what's it, 420 or something parts per million at the moment. It's going up, and at the same time, we've noticed these anomalous temperatures going up of the Earth, this single figure, and therefore the correlation between the two is assumed to be causation. I mean, as scientists, again, we know the correlation doesn't. But
well, I always thought the poverty has gone down, population has gone up. All these things have occurred. Are you going to say one is the cause, one is the effect, and so on? No, lots of things have gone up in the last 150 years, 200 years.
Okay. And we don't know what's causing that then. Let me draw you out a little bit more in this sense, though, that if you look back over the history of the Earth, it's quite clear the temperature has gone up and down because we've had glaciation occurring over many times. And I think back in the 1600s in London, the Thames would freeze over to a depth thick enough for them to hold a fair on it. Doesn't happen these days anymore. So there are changes which are taking place. Of
course there are. Of course. I mean, we know that 50 million years ago, alligator-like things were in Spitsbergen. Of course, they have the ice ages. We mentioned them. They're well recorded in the Vostok ice core.
So what's the cause, though, of those longer-term changes? Have we got any clue as to what caused?
Well, with the ice ages, a man called Milankovitch around 1940, a Serbian astronomer, put forward a good hypothesis that it was primarily due to orbital variations. Now, the thing about that is, with glaciers, be a little bit simplistic about it, but fundamentally, they depend on summer. That may seem a little bit odd, but in the polar regions, you're always going to have snow in the winter. The question is, does it survive the summer? So he proposed you should look at the incoming solar radiation in high latitudes, let's say around 60 degrees in June or in summer, to see how that varies as the Earth's orbit changes due to obliquity, eccentricity, and all so on. And he found that that seemed to have some possibility. And more recently, there have been papers by a fellow named Gerard Rowe, others, Edvardsson in Sweden, who calculated this and found that, Milankovitch was right. There's 100 watts per meter square change in insolation in the Arctic in summer that's associated primarily with this 100,000-year component of the orbits. And that is giving you something. When you talk about CO2, its changes during that period in radiation are on the order of a watt or two per meter squared. Here you have 100 in the right place at the right time. And it looks like that is a pretty good explanation of the ice ages. There are details people will argue about, but that seems fundamentally correct. And so, we do understand that one pretty well. We don't understand precisely why it began about 1 million years ago, and for a few million years before that, instead of being 100,000 years, it was 40,000 years, the dominant periodicity. And then it ended 3-4 million years ago. You no longer had this glaciation cycle. But then, you were very warm 50 million years ago, and paleoclimatologists used to refer to this as a climate optimum. Climate optimum because life was thriving. It wasn't disintegrating. It wasn't catastrophic. It was great. Same thing with medieval optimum. The warm period in the medieval was also called an optimum, and it was a period of wealth, well-being, and so on. The Little Ice Age, as you mentioned, the nice part, you could go skating, but it was a period of plague and hunger and so on, because it wasn't particularly good for agriculture. With CO2 increasing, of course, we've seen a very significant increase in agriculture. One of the curiosities about CO2 as a pollutant is if you got rid of, 60, 70% of it, you die.
All of
You
us
starve to death.
Yeah. Is you mentioned CO2 is increasing by some parts per million. Is that due to is that man-made in its effects, or is there some other cause for it?
There's a lot of argument about it, and how shall I put it? I think there are pretty good cases to be made based on the isotopic composition that it is mostly due to man's activities, burning fossil fuels and cement making, things like that. It's, not a particularly dangerous substance. In your mouth, it's about 40,000 parts per million. In the space station, they allow 5,000 parts. In the submarines, they allow 5,000 parts per million. This is not a killer demon pollution.
No. And they actually pump it into greenhouses to increase the
Of course, productivity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the plants are obviously starved for CO2. They evolved clearly during a period when CO2 is much higher. That has an interesting effect. Not only do they not grow better without CO2 being at the levels they like, but it also makes them more vulnerable to drought because they have these little openings, the alveoli, that are there to take in CO2. And if CO2 is low, they have to open it wider. And when they open it wider, they lose water. And so when you increase CO2, the alveoli shrink and they don't use as much water.
Yeah. So there are benefits to
Huge
CO2, a huge number. Are there any deficits for increasing CO2? I mean, does it contribute to this? I mean, what do you make of this blanket thing that John Kerry?
I mean, that does very little, and almost everyone accepts that. I mean, people doing very careful calculations estimate that doubling CO2 would give you about a degree, 1.1 degrees centigrade. That's not a big deal. And moreover, I mentioned the word doubling, and that is important because the CO2 spectrum is almost saturated, which means, how should I put it? Let's say I paint a window with black paint. That'll keep out light. I add another coat. How much more light does it keep? Not much. It's already pretty much blacked it out.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what happens with absorbing gases. And so you get a certain amount of warming when you increase it from 200 to 400. To get the same amount of warming subsequently, you'd have to increase it from 400 to 800. So each molecule does less.
Yeah.
You're talking about most, if you burnt all the fossil fuels that we know of in the world, maybe it could create 2 degrees, assuming that the feedbacks are not negative. And here one comes into a peculiar issue in the models. I don't think it's that as important as people say, but the models invoke positive feedbacks. They say nature will do everything it can to make it worse. And there's long been something called Le Chatelier's principle that says, natural long living systems try to resist change.
Yes. Yes, there's many examples of that, but this contributes to the idea of the tipping point, isn't it? Once we reach a certain level, then it spirals out of control and there's no way of bringing it back. I've heard that kind of an idea.
I know that's stated often. I don't know of any example with the Earth's climate.
No, but you put it into the models and the models then have a positive feedback.
Actually, positive feedbacks, the tipping point that you're referring to is when you have a feedback that leads to unbounded growth. But if the feedbacks are positive but below a certain level, which is the case in every model, they never lead to anything but an increase in the steady response, the equilibrium response. So this is just throwing around words, buzzwords that sound dangerous, but you have no basis for them.
Is there anyone identified what the tipping point is, and in terms of?
No, we've never seen it.
Never seen it. So there is no scientific consensus about what the tipping point might be.
Oh no, that's purely from politicians. I mean, that's how should I put it? Politicians and activists, I suppose you'd say. I mean, the one crazy thing that dignifies CO2 is if you have fossil fuels and you burn them perfectly cleanly, the two things that will be left are water vapor and CO2.
Yeah.
And so if you want to destroy the energy economy, CO2 is fine. If you name any other pollutant, they can get rid of it. I mean, so it has that attraction to certain people.
Tell me, besides CO2, other gases have been identified as villains in this process.
Oh yeah, methane and nitrous oxide. That's just criminal.
Why?
The reason it's criminal is they are controlling it because they say each molecule is more potent than a CO2 molecule. Okay, there's some truth to that because you have so much CO2 it's saturating. These have so much less that they're not yet saturated. But the total amount is so little that if you got rid of methane and if you got rid of the nitrous oxide and so on, it would make no difference even with today's models. And so getting on a high horse and getting rid of them and destroying agriculture and putting people at risk of starvation is pure sadism.
I mean, that seems to be the way in which a number of countries are moving.
Oh yeah,
you know, Sri Lanka, who's banned the use of phosphates.
Absolutely.
We know also in Holland, which is apparently the second largest agricultural exporter in the world, is trying to close down a third of its farms to prevent.
Yeah. I mean, it's just proof that our leaders are stupid, ignorant, and malicious. There can be no other reason for doing this. It has no impact on climate. It's going to hurt people badly. And it's going to produce nothing.
Why
I mean, the whole issue, by the way, of the policies is slightly insane. I mean, for example, you can look at the curve of CO2 versus time in recent years. There's no sign that any policy has had any impact on it. All those trillions of dollars we've spent have not made a dent in the increase in CO2, its rate of increase even. And yet they are making society poorer and uglier. And they're doing it for no impact on what they claim is controlling climate. So if you really believe that climate is heading for an extremely dangerous state, you'd want to increase resilience if you're not able to impact the climate. Instead, we're saying there's going to be a catastrophe and we want society to be as unresilient as possible so it could suffer more. What government would do that?
It looks like most of them, I think, want to do that.
Yes,
unfortunately. We have a situation whereby most governments, certainly the UK government where I am, and I think probably your government in the US as well, are trying to close down fossil fuels. I mean,
yes.
we have a goal here in the UK to go to carbon zero by 2050. 2050 is our goal here. And before then, the plan is to stop the sale of all diesel and petrol cars by 2030 in this country. That's only 7 years away.
And we're getting rid of gas stoves.
And getting rid of boilers, gas boilers and stoves, yes, by 2035. I think that's the date for that.
Yeah.
Now, what's the effect that going to have on the climate for us? And
not much on the climate, but people who make the replacements for your gas stove and everything else are going to make a lot of money. And all they have to do is make campaign contributions in the US.
Well, will it have any effect on the climate?
No, of course not.
And yet it's going to impoverish a lot of people because the replacement of all these things, the diesel cars and the gas stoves and with heat exchangers, they cost a lot more and they're often much more inefficient.
Oh, yeah. And the electric grid is not equipped to recharge all these cars.
No, it's not. No, that's the problem. The effect of cutting down all fossil fuel power stations, is that sustainable in a worldwide term? What's the effect of that going to be?
It's going to be blackouts, because these are intermittent sources. With respect to windmills, the intermittency is not predictable beyond weather forecasting, which is good for 2-3 days.
No.
You're going to need a backup. Battery technology is not going to match. You'd have to cover the UK with batteries.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a fool's errand. But somehow, I don't understand the psychology of our political leaders. Maybe they think they will go down in history as people who have saved the planet. Maybe this appeals to them. But it's terribly dangerous and it's futile.
The worry for me, I suppose, is that it's with fossil fuels that we have cheap energy.
Yes.
And with cheap energy, you have high standard of living. In fact, the West has been built upon the harnessing of cheap energy. And there are many countries, particularly those in Africa and other third world kind of countries, where they don't have access to cheap energy at all. And in order to pursue these particular goals, what you're telling them is you never will have access to cheap energy. You'll always remain in poverty. You'll always be scrabbling around without any access to improve yourself or to improve your life or your civilization. Seems to me that's not going to be a message which is easy to sell to most of the rest.
Not only is not easy to sell, it's immoral.
Yes.
I mean, all these people virtue signaling over this are condoning what I think any rational person would call evil. I mean, there was an application to the World Bank for money, I think in the Congo Republic, to build a hospital, and they refused to finance it unless it used renewable energy. Which of these fools would want to be operated on at a hospital that was depending on windmills?
Yeah. Can I ask you probably a more difficult question, and it's something we touched upon, or you've touched upon, in terms of psychology, and something which I don't understand. But the IPCC, and I'm told 101 Nobel laureates, and the Dalai Lama, and many other good and great folk all around the world say that we are facing a climate catastrophe. How is it that such a huge group of the great and the good and the clever and the intelligent, the Nobel Prize winners, are not foolish people? How is it that they are still approaching this problem as if this is a real climate emergency? How are they all wrong?
Okay. Let's put it this way. You gave a lot of examples, and I think they are not all the same. There are different reasons for each. I'll begin what I think is the easiest, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As you mentioned, I served on this.
Yeah.
And its aim is to promote the elimination of fossil fuels, but they want to, quote, do it scientifically, okay? So they have 3 groups, one of which is science. Working Group 1. Working Group 1 issues its report. It's about 1,000 pages. It has no index. Clearly, it is not meant to be read. You have Working Group 2 and 3, which are impacts and mitigation. They have nothing to do with science. They take worst case scenarios and make up stories. So you have Working Group 1. Then you have, associated with Working Group 1, a summary for policymakers. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, Working Group 1 consists in scientists, most of whom are chosen by a scientific unit in the UK, or at least that was the case at one point. They're nominated by governments. So, it has an assembly of people from all over the world. Remember, this was a tiny area. One of the most amusing things is to hear about thousands of the world's leading climate scientists. There were probably a few hundred in 1988 at most. At any rate, so they write this report. You have the summary written not by the people in the working group, most of whom were chosen, not all of whom. The leaders of each chapter are chosen by the executive, which is political. At any rate, you get down to the summary, and the leaders of each group participate, but most of the participants are government officials. They go over what the working group one has found, but if they don't like it, they change it, and it's not based on science.
Well, it is based on, yes. If you have a scientific working group that looks at the evidence and then produces a report, how can you change what's written in it?
Well, you do it by the following means. The rules say that the summary comes out 6 months before the report, so the report can be modified to reflect the summary.
But that's the opposite of evidence-based science, isn't it?
Of course, it's nonsense. But in any event, all I'm saying is, if you go to the report itself, you never see projections of catastrophe. In fact, the report itself will say they can't find any convincing evidence that extreme weather relates to global warming. You go through all this stuff. It's a very modest document. Yes, it has to be biased. We found that out. You can't be too critical of the models, but they're following a fairly delicate line. But then the IPCC issues all these reports that are not by Working Group 1. And yet they always say we are a body that consists in thousands of scientists. And so it's a kind of scam.
So let me get this right. You say that the IPCC has some scientists who produce a report based on evidence. They come to the conclusion that there is no climate catastrophe. And yet,
it's selective, even there, it's biased. But even then, no catastrophe.
And then it's taken by another group who then add to it conclusions which are not actually in the evidence.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Gutierrez, when he refers to it, do you think he cares about the Working Group 1 report? He has his own agenda.
Right. Okay, then. Let me ask this question then, because that doesn't make sense to me. That this doesn't make sense to me. What are they motivated by then? Why would they wish to raise climate alarmism if it's not actually present within the science? Why would they have this agenda, this ulterior motive, to present it as such? Where does that come from?
I can't pretend to know what goes on in the minds of people, but ever since the first Earth Day, I think the environmental movement has recognized that the energy sector, as you say, it's the reason for our standard of living, for the well-being of the West, for the extended life expectancies, that is central to control. And in my darker moments, I often feel that, the human race has a totalitarian impulse, especially since the Industrial Revolution and the increasing power of man over his world. And we've run, I think terms like communism, fascism, Nazism have exhausted their utility, and we're left with environmentalism as a mode of control. And that's all I can think of, because, yes, a lot of people will make millions of dollars and billions of dollars on this, but the net effect will be so harmful to society. But it will mean that you have concentrated immense amounts of power.
Let me conclude. We've come to pretty well the end of our discussion, and it's been a very interesting and enlightening discussion. But let me ask you whether you have a crystal ball here as to where things might be going. I mean, the IPCC seems to drive the climate change narrative. Everyone looks to them. Where do you see us being in 5, maybe 10 years' time?
Well, the IPCC is not driving this. It was created to provide the momentum. And it kept failing.
Who's driving it then?
Well, one can't do anything but speculate why people are doing this. There's always been a quest for power. I think people are beginning to think that we have people who are very wealthy and powerful in the world who want to return to feudalism.
So you're not talking about the UN here. You're talking about richer people.
The UN is basically being manipulated. It's looking for its share of the action. I remember the arguments between the UN environmental program and this, who will be able to deal with it. No, I think people, our current oligarchs, our multi-billionaires, just seem to resent the fact that ordinary people are living so well and want to get rid of it. They want to have serfs. We see this in the political parties in the US. I mean, I grew up when the Democrats were basically the party of the labor unions. Today, they're the party of the multi-billionaires, what the French called the fonctionnaires, the people serving them. We might call it the educated elite, but I don't think that's quite accurate. And the welfare clients. So they have their serfs and get rid of the middle. And, you ask, why would anyone want to do that? And who knows? But we don't know how people think. You maybe have a better idea than I do.
I don't, but looking forward to the future, are you optimistic or pessimistic about how things will turn out with respect to the climate issues?
I guess it depends on the time frame. I can't believe that the measures being proposed with net zero and so on, which will cause immense pain and suffering and diminution of all the advances people have made, will reduce their futures, will leave people feeling this is a good thing. And so I think once the suffering begins, there'll be a much greater incentive to question this. But unfortunately, I think we've gotten to that stage where it's going to be the pain that'll turn this around.
How far off is the pain, Richard?
Look at your legislation. I mean, they're trying to impose things. They run into trouble, so they delay them. So it's hard to predict. I mean, they're going to hear, all sorts of people are proposing getting rid of gas stoves. And they realize this is electorally a losing proposition. So, they'll back off a little. So it's hard to tell.
Right. Any last words for what you would say to people at large in terms of how they approach climate change?
Well, I think the most important thing at this stage, it's been propagandized among kids. We have a kindergarten climate curriculum. This is stupid. Maybe the first thing is stop frightening children and stop honoring children who are screaming about this.
Yeah.
I just read that Greta Thunberg got an honorary doctorate from the University of Helsinki in theology.
Theology.
Yes.
Interesting, isn't it? But and it's not just in schools, in kindergartens. It's in churches too. Churches seem to have taken up this as a massive thing to promote that climate change has become, I suppose, the new morality which is guiding us, which is probably why theology is appropriate here.
Exactly. I think this is a deeper problem in society when clergymen can no longer find a religious rationale for their work. The analogies between the climate issue and COVID are quite remarkable.
How?
Just the business of manipulating suppression of opposition and so on. There's something sort of creepy about this whole thing.
There's a lot of control going on, which again, and what surprises me is that it seems to be global. So the same changes are taking place, the same laws, the same things taking place, no matter which country you look at, whether it's the States, the UK, Europe, whether it's Australia.
Yeah. In this respect, COVID was a little different from climate. That is to say, countries like China and so on also participated in this idiocy. Whereas in climate, China and India and much of the rest of the world are ignoring it, basically, and letting the US, the Anglosphere, the EU go their merry way.
Well, China is still building coal-fired power stations at a rate of something like 3 a week.
Also, most of Africa is beginning to wake up to this as colonialism renewed. And so, they're fighting back.
Yeah, and good for them, I think.
Yeah.
Well, Richard Lindzen, thank you ever so much for your time today. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. It's been very, very interesting. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.